Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, it's time to take your questions, and they're all coming from Twitter this week. Our first one comes from Patricia Sutherland, who asks, what exactly does a House Leader do, and how has it changed over the years? So the House Leader is the MP, or I guess technically a minister on the government side, who kind of decides the day-to-day business within the House of Commons. So the government House Leader is the one who helps prioritize what bills are going to be debated on what day, and that kind of thing. So they play a large kind of traffic management role in terms of ensuring that people are up for debate for particular bills and that there's a kind of schedule that they're trying to adhere to and so on. But there's also a large tactical component to this as well, because opposition House Leaders will help determine what kind of tactics they want to use to stymie bills if that's what they're trying to do. And this is more and more common in that regard. So they will, use things from everything like ensuring that everyone is speaking to a particular bill so they can kind of run out the clock, or they will use particular procedural moves like dilatory motions or so on. And so the opposition House Leaders will often be in charge of coordinating that kind of a response to a bill. So you've kind of got this strategizing on both sides. And in terms of how it's changed over the years, that's a lot of what it has been, is kind of ramping up this tactical gamesmanship between the two different sides. Part of it has also been sort of formalizing, because in Canada in particular, we've gotten in this really bad habit of having these rigid speaking lists and so on. That didn't always used to happen. I mean, we didn't have speaking lists and question period until the early 90s. In part because we had 5 parties in the House at that point, and they wanted to find a way to make it more fair so that they had proportionate numbers of questions and so on. And that led to formalized speaking lists, which are not really in the standing orders, but it's something that they adhere to, which I also think is one of the things they need to do away with in order to empower the speaker, but that's a tale for another day. But it's this kind of formalizing and almost codifying speaking lists and so on that has changed over the course of the years. And like I said, also it's a much more tactical game, and the House Leader has to do a lot more of that kind of aspect. So, for example, that could include things like negotiating time allocation. So we want this bill to get passed by this particular day. So in the current context, that would mean negotiating with the NDP in order to ensure that they are on board and they will support a time allocation motion so that debate can be cut off at a certain point, and it can be voted on. So those are kinds of things that the House Leaders will help discuss amongst themselves. It's, depending on who the personalities involved, can be depending on how collegial this ends up being. But those are kinds of things that the House Leader does. And there's been another aspect of it as well, which has been that the House Leader will sometimes be the person in question period who will try and take the heat off of the Prime Minister or certain ministers. And we're seeing more and more of this lately, and I think this is partially why Karina Gould got picked in the recent shuffle, because she started doing this a lot with a lot of the accusations that the Conservatives were putting forward, and she would try and stand up and give a positive spin on things the government had been doing around childcare and so on and so on. So I think that may also have been one of the considerations as to why they wanted her in that position, is because she could provide a friendlier face in terms of providing some of that deflection than Mark Holland, who on occasion, when he wasn't being terribly sanctimonious, could also get a bit testy on that. So that's how that works. All right, we've got two questions here which are very similar. One of them, Clay Thompson asks, I'd like to know what's happening with our media. Why is Pierre Poilievre getting away with all of his scandals? I'm baffled by it. Similarly, Jackie Blue asks, why does the media seem hands-off on Poilievre, not pushing back on him? Are they afraid of accusations of bias or committed to false balance? Or what is it that prevents them from giving him the same scrutiny they give everyone they give with every one of the Liberals in the PM? So, a couple of different things there. One of them is that, yes, the government being the government, the media will try and give them added scrutiny. And some of them feel opposition leaders are less needed to be scrutinized because they're not the government. That's something I don't necessarily agree with, particularly because we consider them a potential government in waiting. But that's one of the things that has come up. I think part of this is, I think there is, amongst a lot of journalists, they are afraid of being accused of bias, and that's also partially what feeds into this both sidesism. This presentation of false balance, that, because they want to be seen as neutral, and so they will provide this particular false balance. These guys say this, these guys say that, you decide, kind of thing, which is an ethos I really personally do not like and do not agree with, because that has basically enabled particular parties to lie with absolute abandon because they know they won't be called on it with any particular frequency. Sometimes they will if it's particularly egregious, but 98% of the time they won't be. It'll just be Pierre Poilievre says this, Justin Trudeau says that, you decide. So that's kind of what that is. There is also a fear among some of them that if they push too hard, that they will be basically shut out by the party. And we've just recently seen, for example, Power and Politics on CBC. The Conservatives were boycotting them for months, which meant that you had no Conservative MPs showing up on any of the panels or discussions. And some people really try and avoid that because then it looks like you are either favoring one side or so on. That's partially what journalists need to learn how to negotiate, is that if one side isn't going to cooperate, how you still basically include their viewpoints without having them talk to you directly. I think that's not a difficult thing to deal with, particularly when they're on social media all the time, so you can basically just quote from that. But there is this particular trepidation that if you are perceived as being too mean to them, then they won't talk to you. And because it's a pretty small pool, both on the media and in the political side, that there's this sense that you're going to miss out or so on. So those are some of the reasons. It's not really that they're in the bag for Poilievre. It's this notion that the government deserves more scrutiny because they're the government. And yeah, there's this sense of false balance that too many of them adhere a little too closely to because they want to come off as neutral. There's a whole other debate that can be had about the construction of neutrality in media, which is not a discussion we're going to have today, but that is part of what this involves. But again, yeah, it's not that they're in the tank for Poilievre. This is the kind of ethos by which they've adopted in terms of how they want to look balanced and neutral. And I don't think it always works necessarily. And I think it empowers some of the bad faith. But that's kind of the situation that our media is in these days. Our last question is from H. Volkhammer, who asks, do you think the strategy, and I will read that in a second, will help the Liberals with their comms? Someone who can refute the lies and disinfo. And he's quoting from Jacques Leger, who's saying, the Liberals need a Jen Psaki type official spokesperson willing to take the questions all day long, as well as being willing to pull a pin out of the grenade once in a while. The backgrounders aren't doing it. That's an interesting thought and question in terms of how governments do their communications. And, the Americans have their daily press briefings, where you have your official spokesperson for the president who answers all manner of things. And that's not really something we do in Canada. And I don't know that it's something we necessarily want to be doing because part of it is that it feeds the kind of messaging environment that is already a problem. And part of it is we have a tendency in Canada to hear from ministers and the Prime Minister more often, in part because of the way our parliamentary structure works, so that they're in the House of Commons more often. And therefore we can hear them in that particular forum, and as well as catching them in and out of the chamber or in and out of the building to a greater regularity than Americans have that kind of access, because their president does not attend Congress on a daily basis or several times a weekly basis as we have in Canada. So they don't have those same abilities to hear from their head of government the way that we do. So that's part of why we've got a slightly different constructed difference. Now, in terms of, the Liberals' particular communication strategy, I mean, I am one of the biggest critics of how they feel they need to present everything, and why, my absolute completely bafflement as to why they can't be frank about any of their particular files, and need to constantly wrap it up in this happy clappy pablum messaging that they do, which I personally don't feel is working for them, because it just creates more problems for them than it solves. And it helps turn scandals and magnify them for this government, rather than actually dealing with their problems head on, which they have an absolute allergy to doing, which is frustrating to watch, particularly when you're trying to get answers on particular issues or questions, and you're just handed this pat, happy, clappy response, which satisfies nobody. But this is how their particular communications geniuses think that they're going to win the news cycle every day. And this notion that if they always present a happy, particular narrative or tone, that's going to win out over being frank and honest about things, which I personally don't agree with. So in terms of having a person who could do that for them, I personally would rather the ministers be able to do that for themselves, rather than having an official spokesperson come out every day and delivering those lines for them. I think there's a sense of more accountability when you've got the minister themselves giving those particular messages, rather than an official spokesperson who's got a binder full of lines for the entire government and cabinet, rather than individual ones. So I don't know that I think it would do better if they had a particular person like this. I would just rather them have the ministers basically own up to their own files and be frank with us about what's going on. And, that might help them with, their particular communication strategy, or coming across better and more authentic to Canadians than just this kind of smile they plaster on and say, isn't it great that we're doing this, even though you're avoiding what the actual issue is. So that's my personal take. I'm not a communications genius in the PMO, so what do I know? But I don't know that it would necessarily help, because I don't think that particular person would help, because I don't think it's the root of the problem. The root of the problem is the ethos around messaging that this government has bought into, and which dominates politics these days. Yeah, I think that's what really needs to change, rather than having a point person who would do that. And that's everything for this week. Thanks for all of your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.